and welcome along to what is now Past Conversation number 16, and it's great today to be joined by Louise Bell. Louise is someone I've known for a while now, and she's a researcher with a particular focus on the First World War, and in particular again about those who lost limbs as a result of conflict. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over to Louise and she can say hello and introduce herself.
Yep, hi, as Paul said, I'm Louise. I am First World War historian looking at prosthetic limbs in the First World War. I also work at the moment with Edinburgh Napier University on a research project looking at, was there a war books boom, that's really difficult to say, after the First World War in Scotland in particular, which is part of a wider project looking at this. But yeah, I also do a million voluntary projects, so I'm always involved in history in some way.
Louise, curious to know about your time at school and when it came to studying history. Have you any memories of studying history at school?
I do actually. History was one of my favourite subjects when I was at school, although I almost didn't do it the whole way through. So when I got to higher history, I didn't do very well in the exam and decided that meant I couldn't do advanced higher history, and that just wasn't allowed because of the grade I got, and got myself really worked off by that. So I decided to do advanced higher maths instead, as you do. And about 2 days into maths, I went, this was a mistake, and basically left and went downstairs to where the history classrooms were. And I feel that kind of sums up my weird relationship with history. There's always been points in my life where I've always not done it, and then I'm still here, still doing it. But I had a really great teacher at high school, Mr. Fraser, and I think it's really down to him that I love history so much. He just made it kind of interesting and exciting. I imagine he's a bit like you are at school. So, and yeah, it was really thanks to him that I ended up, especially going into advanced history, and he took us on like sort of great trips. We went down to London where we did advanced history, and we got to go to the Imperial War Museum and HMS Belfast and all of that. He was the cool teacher that we got to go on a school trip with as well, so that was always nice. But I think, yeah, most of my memories of school are do with him. But then even thinking further back, sort of first, second year, I always remember you kind of do those, I'm going to say boring subjects that look at farming and mining and things that never really interested me. And you always got the video, TV rolled in with the video, and you got to watch all these ridiculous videos looking at this. And I always remember specifically the one where there's the mining accident, and I think it's the wee boy loses a leg essentially, and everybody, like the boys all thought this was dead gross and that, and I always thought that was great. That kind of makes sense as to why I do medical history, like looking back now. But you've made me think about that a lot actually. Yeah, that probably explains a lot about me. But yeah, I loved history at school.
Now, Louise, something I've been looking forward to talking to you about is this. It's your book, the Armistice book that you put together, Images of the National Archive. Just wondering if you could tell us a wee bit about it.
Yep, I'll explain how that came about. It's probably a good idea to begin with. So I worked at the National Archives from November 2015 to March 2018 and was their First World War diverse histories researcher. So basically I looked at anything that wasn't male, white, middle class, able-bodied, etc. That was my remit. So, I mean, the book maybe is a bit more of a surprise when I tell you that, because this is obviously very obvious First World War history that I'm looking at in it. Yeah, I was very lucky that I actually can't remember how it came about that I started writing it. I think one of my colleagues had been given the task, and we kind of, I don't know if I should say this anyway, but joked in the pub that I'd quite like to write a book, and then suddenly I was writing a book. I feel like that's how it came about. It was probably a different experience from most people writing a book, because I was basically told what they wanted from me. It wasn't my ideas necessarily. And it was a very, very short turnaround as well. I think I found out the year before it was, so I think maybe found out October, November 2017, and then didn't get my contract through until the sort of New Year 2018, and they were like, yeah, we need the book in by May, and I was like, right, okay, because a lot of it is stuff I didn't know about. I mean, you've got all the treaties after First World War and to do with armistice. And I mean, as I say, I'm not a military historian in that aspect, so I had to do a lot of research for this. And it had to be images that were already sort of digitised by the National Archives. That kind of didn't, I mean, there's things I wanted to write about that I couldn't because we didn't have the images and we'd have to pay to digitise images and stuff. So I was kind of, my hand was forced as to what I could write about. But there were things that they wanted to be included that I missed out because I didn't have the time to do it justice and research it. So if you look inside it, I've got my copy open just now, so I'm looking at it. It is sort of looking at all the treaties that came around armistice and after armistice, demobilisation of the men. I've put in a chapter about the women's services because obviously women have to be represented in the book somewhere. There's a chapter on disability, which I think is probably the best chapter because that's what I do. So I was more comfortable writing that chapter. And then you've got your sort of things you'd expect about like Peace Day and the Unknown Warrior and the Cenotaph. So it was a really interesting experience and I did enjoy it. I didn't enjoy how it took over my summer that year, but yeah, it was, the team at Pen and Sword were great and really wonderful to work with. We did have to push the deadline back at one point because I just couldn't get it done for the May. And they were all really understanding about that. And we still got it out in time for the centenary of Armistice. So that was the sort of main bonus. Although I didn't know it was coming out when it did because I thought we had to push the date back because I'd been a bit slow. And yeah, then suddenly it just appeared and I was like, oh my God, like, I've now got a book out. And yeah, it's probably one of the best things that came out of that job was getting to write a book because it is quite nice to have a book out, isn't it?
Now, Louise, as I've already mentioned, the research that you've carried out in the past and that you continue to is focused upon those who've lost their limbs as a result of conflict during the First World War. Just wondering if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yep, so again, I'll explain how I came into this research and then I'll tell you a bit about what was happening at that time. So when I was at uni, really history kind of boiled down to you do Scottish history or you do history of medicine. That's kind of what it felt like. And now, as I've explained, very much more interested in sort of gory, weird stuff. So I did a lot of history of medicine classes at undergrad. And then once I finished undergrad, I kind of had a panic about my life and I ended up doing a master's, which I don't regret now. It was one of the best choices I made in my life. And I did the MSc in health history at Strathclyde. And I went into that kind of thinking that I wanted to look at prosthetic limbs and probably the First World War, but I wasn't 100% sure. Initially, people weren't very supportive about me doing it, so I kind of went to look at something else, and I was like, no, this is really important. I'm really interested in this. I have to come back and look at it. Because I'd read like one line in a sort of generic history of medicine book at undergrad that was like, men lost limbs in the war. And I was like, great, but that's it. What? Like, you need to expand on that. Like, that was infuriating to me. So obviously I decided that I was going to do that. I was going to do this research. So yeah, I did my master's dissertation on men who lost limbs in the First World War, looking at Erskine and Roehampton and kind of comparing what was happening in those two institutions. And I mean, it is sort of, I think, a very important research area. I mean, you've got around 41,000 British men returning from the war missing one or more limbs. You've got more cases of lost legs than arms, and I think my research has focused a lot more on sort of prosthetic legs than it has arms. I was kind of chatting about this a few years ago and I was like, that's really interesting. That's kind of what we focus on, is the sort of loss of leg more than anything. But I suppose, as they said, you get by easier if you've injured an arm or lost an arm in this case than you can if you've done something to one of your legs. So I was like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. There seems to be a lot more focus on sort of legs when I look at stuff, and you always see more examples of prosthetic legs in a museum than you do arms, etc. So yeah, it's a time of sort of vast improvement, I think, in what's going on with prosthetic limbs. You go from your sort of piratey peg leg to a sort of more, I guess, beautiful, but also just well-constructed piece of engineering, I think is the best way to describe what's going on. I mean, a lot of them are still made from wood, but you can kind of see joints starting to appear and sort of how to make it easier for men to move more naturally, I think, is the sort of idea behind it all. And you've got a sort of a lot of rehabilitation happening at this time, and your usual sort of sports days and things like that. Although speaking to you, Paul, I'll put in an anecdote about golf because we all know you've been playing that so much recently. Golf was actually used a lot, especially, I've seen a lot of examples from Wales about this, in terms of, because of the different terrains, it's actually really good for walking with your prosthetic leg to kind of get used to adapting to different terrains and not just your sort of concrete ground outside. So I always find that's really interesting. And I don't get to say that enough, so I'm glad that actually I'm talking to you now about this. But yeah, and a lot of sort of rehabilitation in terms of employment as well, and see a lot of employment agencies being set up for these men, and there's so much happening, and that continues into the interwar period, and I'm assuming more into the Second World War, but I don't know anything about that yet. So yeah, there's still a lot of work I think needs to be done, especially on Britain. You've got Heather Perry's written a book about Germany and sort of the work that I look at, but there's not a sort of concise book for Britain and the First World War and prosthetic limbs and limbless men. So maybe that'll be my next book.
And Louise, just lastly, before we finish up, just curious if any young people are listening into this or watching this, if you were to give them any kind of advice, I suppose, about a career or just an interest in history and historical research.
That's actually a tricky one. I mean, I think I'm going to go for something sort of more generic, like you don't need to know what you're interested in just now if you're young. I mean, I didn't. I mean, when I was at school, because of what we're taught, I was very interested in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, obviously, and then did my sort of extended essay in advanced higher on civil defence in Britain, and that's what I was interested in at the time. It's obviously a vast difference to what I'm interested in now, so don't be afraid of those interests changing either. But also directly be nice to people, because I feel like I've got a lot of things in my career and just in my historical life so far, because I have been nice to people, I've taken time to chat to people, I've networked with people, and I think that will always pay off at some point, because people will remember you because you were that nice person. And yeah, I really struggle with an answer to this one, because I feel like my historical career and interests have just kind of been all over the place at all times. So I think, yeah, don't worry. Like, something will work out. You'll find something that will interest you, and you'll have various interests, and that's completely fine. And yeah, be nice, listen to other people, but also feel like you can talk about your interests to people as well. People will be interested.